Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 759th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alison Hearst, Alice Bucknell, Kahlil Robert Irving, Hasan Elahi, and Charlotte Kent. We're thrilled to welcome poet Courtney Bush here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Alison Hearst is curator at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. She curates the museum's Focus exhibition series and has presented solo exhibitions by influential artists, including Fred Tomaselli, Joyce Pensado, and Lorna Simpson. She organized the 20-year survey Robin O'Neill, We the Masses, and was also the curator of Donald Sultan, The Disaster Paintings. Alice Bucknell is an artist, writer, and curator working primarily with game engines and speculative fiction strategies. Her current work explores interconnections of architecture, ecology, magic, and non-human and machine intelligence. In 2021, she established New Mystics, an editorial platform merging magic and technology. She has exhibited internationally, and her writing appears regularly in publications including ArtReview and Flash Art. Kahlil Robert Irving is an artist currently based in the USA. In December 2021, Irving opened his first museum solo exhibition, Projects, Kahlil Robert Irving at the Museum of Modern Art. Irving recently participated in Social Works 2 at Gagosian Gallery in London. Among other recognitions, he was awarded the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Biennial Award in 2019 and the Joan Mitchell Foundation Grant in 2020. Hasan Elahi is an artist examining issues of surveillance, citizenship, migration, transport, and the challenges of borders and frontiers. His work has been presented in numerous exhibitions and venues and is frequently in the media, including in the New York Times, Forbes, and Wired. His recent awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship, among others. And our host today, Assistant Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University, Dr. Charlotte Kent, has a particular interest in historical frameworks for art practices with a research focus on contemporary digital culture and the absurd. She writes for assorted magazines and various academic journals. She is an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I will pass it over to you, Charlotte.
Hi, everyone, and thank you. Such impressive bios. Let's see. I am really pleased to be able to have a conversation about this exhibit that opened in Fort Worth a couple of weeks ago. I got to be there at the opening and see it unfold. It's an enormous exhibit. We have not only the curator, but 3 of the 50 artists who are in the show, making it also quite substantial, and like thinking about how to even begin to sort of talk about this and frame it is overwhelming. I wanted to start today actually just by having Alison talk a little bit about how and when she conceived of this exhibition. It seems so timely, and as we have spent so much of the last few years immersed by necessity in digital technologies, to do a kind of overview of this kind of the different ways that artists work with media and technologies to speak about culture and society, our politics, our lives. But I wasn't clear, like, did this occur to you during the pandemic, or was it something that had been brewing for longer than that?
Thank you so much for having me, Charlotte, and to everybody at the Brooklyn Rail for organizing. And thank you all for being here, all the artists and audience members. So just to give a little background on kind of the impetus of this exhibition, new media and digital technologies have long been something that I've had an interest in. It's the type of work that I've been wanting to show in the museum and in a more impactful way. but really the pandemic is what spurred this exhibition in particular. Of course, like us all, we were shifting, and to use a very pandemic word, pivoting, to try to share, as museums, we were trying to share our collections, our exhibition programming to people. Since our doors were closed, we were often mediating that through screens. A colleague, Lee Hallman, and I developed a program called Modern TV, where we were sharing videos of works in our collection. Also, a video by Mark Bradford, whose exhibition was shut down here due to the pandemic a week in. So this is something that we were talking about and thinking about, and it just really sparked the idea that I wanted to take a deeper dive, thinking about artists that have been considering the screen as both a tool and a subject matter in a serious way, and to also show that this has been a long road coming. This, of course, was crystallized during the pandemic, this screen mediated life, but this is something that's been underway for a really long time. So I really conceived the project in summer 2020 and have been working on it since. And something that is also interesting during the planning is I didn't meet a lot of the artists in person during the programming. We were doing online studio visits and sharing things, by text and email. So that also was something that I think really reflects the ethos of the show, but also just reflects the times that we've been in.
I think one of the things that was sort of notable to me was a choice that you made, which you talked about actually in the catalog essay briefly, that, often digital, I'm going to use the term digital art, but this sort of broad work is often, positioned as coming out of new media. But with this it gets inflected with film and with some of these other things. And you made the choice to sort of be thinking about screens more in a sort of personalized approach, like the television screen, though had been the sort of family hearth, really very quickly became something like people had their own TVs in their own rooms, right? And the way in which that sort of is a slightly different thing than like the movie screen per se, right? When did you start to think about some of those types of choices, this idea of the kind of personal relationship to screens that is part of what is in the show?
Of course, like you mentioned, screen culture can encapsulate so much, including cinema, but I really wanted to focus on kind of consumer grade screens, such as televisions, computers, and smartphones, really because that's the main thoroughfare that we're receiving information, but also creating content as well. So just, again, I think, there have been shows, of course, dealing with technology, maybe dealing with the internet, these kind of broader themes. But for me, I think since the screen was placed at the very axis of my art viewing experience and my interactions with colleagues and friends, I was really thinking of this, physical consumer grade screen, which of course, really starts with the television in people's homes. I start the show in 1969, which is the year of the Apollo 11 moon landing, really because that's the first event where 650 million people worldwide were watching that televised live broadcast. Of course, this is something that we're all used to today, but that was really the first moment in which screens were connecting people in their homes in a really, grand scale. It's also the same year that ARPANET was invented, which is, of course, the prototype to the internet as well. So just this moment where screens were connecting people on a grander scale than ever before.
I wonder if we can pull up the slides now just to show one of the installation images. So often with shows like this, people expect to be surrounded by, moving images and so forth. And you included a section called digital abstraction. And that's sort of the view that we're having here right now. And I remember when we spoke a little bit about it, you were interested in helping people also make the connection to the way in which these technologies were inflecting all kinds of practices. Can I, like, what's the response been? Have people like made that connection? Like, how's it been for people to suddenly walk into a room that can feel potentially like a very ordinary museum room of like square things on walls?
It's been really interesting, especially in touring this. I gave a tour last night to some local patrons and supporters, and they were really surprised to see a room full of paintings, like you mentioned. But I think, I also want to mention a show of this subject matter has never been seen in the entire region. I mean, I was trying to trace back the last possible show that even comes close to this exhibition was in Chicago several years ago. So, really this is new to a lot of our audience here, but I also wanted to connect to the museum itself. We have such a rich collection of AbX and formalist abstraction that I felt it was really important to kind of make that connection with this theme. Of course, many themes can arise in this topic of screen culture, but I felt it was really important to draw the connection to our collection by having a pretty large representation of formalist abstraction and showing people that maybe aren't familiar with this type of work or that were overwhelmed by the thought of this show, to show them how artists working in all media, even traditionally analog media such as painting, are incorporating technology and the screen into their everyday practice.
We're now looking at, it's sort of hard to say it's the second room in the show exactly, but you can almost see in the back there, there's this little orange strip. We'll get to that maybe at some point, but there's a sort of opening room that sort of is a brief chronological moment. It's overall the show doesn't sort of hold that, as a tight, it's not very art historical in that sense of like progressing through time, right? But one of the things is in that initial room, you have the Warhol computer, which I thought was really interesting, especially given the Warhol collection that the Modern has. And then you have this Lynn Hirschman-Leeson piece, which you can see against this green wall, which is a living room. It's an installation work. And this speaks a little bit to how you were trying to connect it to Texas, right? That this is a work where the character Lorna in the TV that you can just barely see illuminated there in this image is, so you eventually discover that she's supposed to be in Texas. How were you making these connections as you were pulling these works together? Was this something you were intentionally trying to pull out? Was like the sort of moments of Texas, or were you sort of startled as you found that it kept recurring?
I think a little bit of both, honestly. There's several artists in the show, such as Liz LaFleur and John Pomara, as well as Kristen Lucas, that are artists in Texas. I wanted to have that regional connection to artists that are working within, this realm in the exhibition. But, honestly, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson is someone I felt was super important, of course, to include in this show as I was beginning planning it. And I was looking at several works and realized, kind of forgot about this piece's connection to Texas, this agoraphobic woman that the piece is based upon. It also has a soundtrack that's made by the Texas musician Terry Allen and was produced by Texas Tech University. So, of course, when I started kind of I guess, reorienting myself with this piece, it became quickly apparent that this was the one I wanted to have. But of course, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson was an artist that was on my list from the very beginning too. So some connections were very intentional, and then some kind of revealed themselves in surprising ways, which I think, is a really fun part of organizing shows like this.
People were really tentative to be in the space and to touch it. Has that shifted as people have gotten more used to the exhibition? I mean, it's one of those difficult things with interactive works. People sometimes are almost afraid to start to be involved.
It's been really great. I will say our attendance numbers have been so fantastic since the show's been open. And every time I go over there, I usually do see a cluster of people hanging out, sitting in the living room as if it was their own and flipping through the channels. I've also seen people sitting at the Warhol Amiga computer and clicking through. So I think people are kind of, getting oriented with it. I think people have already had some repeat visits to the museum and feel more comfortable. And I think, our staff here too has really been great at jumping in and kind of directing people as to what and what not they can interact with.
I think we might jump around now just for a moment, because I want to involve Kahlil for a second, because it's this other sort of installation like room that you produced with that sort of overwhelmed me. So Kahlil, I want to talk to you both about like how you put this space together, the wallpaper, the sculptures. This is a really complicated work. And I did this thing when I first walked into it, where I was looking around. I was like, if I would look around, I will start to piece together what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing. And, that sort of, before I'm told what it is, right? And I think it's a really challenging work because there's so much content in it. So Kahlil, can you talk a little bit about how you and Alison worked to set this up?
Well, Alison and I have been in touch for a while about a myriad of different things, and she invited me to participate in this exhibition, and I kind of thought it was at first I think it's a little bit weird because I don't think of myself as like in the normative conversation around art and technology or the digital. I didn't necessarily include myself because in a lot of ways I think about what we're seeing in relationship more to photography, but photography, mass production, serial reproduction, and then analog production of photography into the digital. I started to kind of see where that kind of line threaded that needle. But one thing that I tried to kind of engage and like talk with Alison about is how the through line or the access, or even the beginning of the conversation where we're talking about, where Alison was sharing that we're able to mediate and gather so much from our phones or television through the last several decades, that for me, in a lot of ways, this installation could be seen diaristically. That there's a picture of Oakman Wazer next to a friend of mine dressed up as Nathan Fielder for Halloween, next to an image of a man going up on the escalator in New York City. And then next to that, here actually in this picture in the wall, there's a picture of from Google Maps of a corner here in St. Louis, where I'm from. And then the picture next to it is a building that has been built in the place in which the previous building was. But next to that is a painting that is trying to replicate what we see on the wall. And maybe there's more complications with that. With Alison, she really gave me a little bit of freedom and a little bit of space to kind of negotiate this like 22 by 22 by 22 foot room. It also has a skylight in it too, so there's a little bit more fresh daylight that comes into the room. But really, in a lot of ways, I wanted to make an installation that was a bit different from previous installations, where the wallpapers are different shapes and the wall is also engaged with painting in a digital print that's framed. And Alison was a really great partner to kind of go back and forth with. And I also made this work thinking about the work that was in the room previously, and it was a series of small paintings of Dana Schutz, and I was really captivated by Dana's use of color and tried to instigate that in my project too.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I'm sort of intrigued. I didn't know about that history. So what were some of the colors that sort of drew you, that made you start thinking about them in your images?
Well, you see, like in Dana Schutz, those paintings, there was like really bright yellows, oranges, greens, reds. And if you see on the right side of this wallpaper here, you see the guy with the big pipes, and then you see the Emancipation Monument, and you keep going into the corner. You see that yellow rectangle that's in the middle underneath the back of a pickup truck. And just little moments like that just kind of pulled in and kind of referenced my experience. But it's like the one thing that I really appreciate with Alison's curatorial premise here with this project is that it also allows for so much to kind of go through the work. Like she's set the premise, but even saying, like using the title of I'll Be Your Mirror. I don't know the song that refers to, but I just hear it and think of it as so sensual. And so in a lot of ways, some of the content is like kind of missable, or the color usage or the function of color in this room could be missed, but the overwhelming takes over, or someone can acknowledge how bright it is or how many colors are used, and they may miss some of the content. And I think the space of fluidity in terms of access to content and information in this exhibition is one thing that I find really successful, and also makes room for more people to kind of engage in a more kind of simpler way that then can lead them to more specific content relationships.
Totally. It was actually one of the things that I really admired overall about the exhibition, right? It feels as if there's often this sort of juxtaposition between a formal approach to art and a content or ideological approach to art. And it's really easy sometimes when work has a lot of content going on to really explicitly sort of want to dive into that and unpack it and talk about it and analyze it and contextualize it and connect it, sometimes at a loss to the formalism that is often for people who don't know all of those connections the way in, as you were just saying, because in fact, looking
right
of what we're doing here, right, experiencing. And I think, your sculptures, which I'm just now realizing we don't have a close-up of any of them, I don't think. So with that being the case, do you mind just describing, describing it so that people can get a sense of what it is that they see there on these plinths?
In the installation, there's a work from, these works were formed in 2019 and recently finished. The two larger ones in the middle of the room were completed this year. And the ceramic sculptures are really kind of developed from a series of molds and a kind of like something that I've kind of like thought of as like a gravity casting. And it's like I'm adding a lot of clay into some plaster walls and then peeling those walls away. But then what we're left with is like this gray kind of form that then gets covered in image transfers that kind of relate specifically to the wallpaper here in this room, but also in other projects. And they kind of become this kind of a fossil, but then, a fossil is made from pressure, a kind of compressed pressure, whereas these are fossils that are of a kind of becoming that is built through time, not something that is kind of pressed through time. So they relate to different patterns in my digital archive and image archive that I have. There are forms that relate or that are similar to soda bottles or to-go boxes or vases. And those forms are made from a library of molds that I have that I've either made or I've purchased. And then one of the biggest points of these works is just their kind of memorialization of a specific time or a specific moment that is also kind of something and nothing at the same time. And that's, I kind of catch your eye with the gold, but really it's a facsimile.
So Alison, how is this for you a part of, this notion of, that you were sort of cultivating around I'll Be Your Mirror, right? Not only these, the images and the wallpapers and all of that stuff, but also introducing the sculptures into it.
Yeah, so I mean, Kahlil kind of touched upon this a bit too, but there is a fluidity to the show. I did organize it by 9 different themes where I felt like the screen and art intersected most dynamically, but the themes are really quite loose. A lot of the works could fit in several of the themes. I didn't want to, overwhelm and be overbearing with this. I wanted, the artworks to really sing on their own. But with Kahlil, I mean, I was a fan of his work already, and just was really thinking of this idea of visual culture in the age of screens. And I felt like his work represented that really well. You know, the wallpaper kind of demonstrates an archive of a life lived online, while the physical sculptures have this tension, you know, between, they have, you know, of course, images on them that reference the wallpaper, reference different, you know, status updates and whatnot. So I felt like there was this really nice tension between kind of the physical detritus that's found in the street, and as well as this kind of online trail of debris that we leave as users too. So that's really why I wanted to bring that in. I liked this kind of connection to the physical as well. And you know, of course, I love the sculptures, and I thought that, you know, I wanted to have them in this show too for all sorts of reasons.
It's
I feel like,
go
can
ahead.
I share some? I also feel like there's a poetry that exists in a lot of the work that I don't think is usually like kind of communicated to, like when we think about art and technology. And for me, a lot of the kind of essence of the larger sculptures that are presented here relate to also this kind of physicalization of a poetry. You know, we think of it, or a more dimensional sense of poetry, where we have concrete poetry. And there's a really beautiful book published by Primary Information, Women in Concrete Poetry, from 1970 to 1990s. And there, it's still using on the flat page to make form with text. But for me, I'm really trying to make text or form kind of more dimensional, in a kind of three-dimensional sense. And I think a lot of the work that we'll talk about today, but also just from the experience, is we're dimensionalizing a certain kind of poetry into an apparatus that becomes something that which you can interact with. And it kind of goes beyond the flatness of the work, but also it kind of instigates product or production. It instigates visual and interaction, and also the sensibility in which what one will experience emotionally when they leave the exhibition.
That was beautifully put. Thank you. It feels like a much more poetic and conceptually rich thing than one of the things I was about to contribute, which is that the other side of "I'll Be Your Mirror" as a title that really sort of hit me was because this felt like an art show. Right. I didn't feel like, as I was moving through it, like this is digital art or I'm looking at technology. Right. I was really confronted with art over and over and over again. The way in which art is a mirror. Right. I mean, it's been, at least for me, it's been an important mirror to different moments in my life, and to giving me a way to reflect on the experiences I'm having, and sometimes the problems I'm having, and how to find some space around them. That I thought was really a sort of interesting other aspect of this show that hasn't necessarily, you know, been articulated, but I think is really there in this poetic sense, right, of the connection with it. Just because of the wall, just to sort of make some connections across the different pieces that the three of you included in the show, I'm wondering if we can go to Hasan's work now, because it also takes images that he's been taking since shortly after 9/11. If I understand correctly, you are now over 150,000 of them. That's obviously just a selection. Mm-hmm. But this is a different type of curating of digital images, one that you've been producing these images, but also then intentionally and maybe I want to say like aggressively, like sharing them, being like, here you go, right? Here's the photo of me right now. Can you speak a little bit about this project and the different versions of it?
Sure. So this project started out shortly after 9/11, when I was erroneously reported as a terrorist suspect. You know, brown guy, Muslim, what else? So I spent 6 months of my life justifying every moment of my existence to the FBI, convincing that I was not a terrorist. And eventually, after 9 consecutive polygraphs and many, many, many months of questioning, they're like, well, everything's okay. And my thing was, well, yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell you guys all along. Everything is okay. Can I get a letter saying that I'm okay? And there's a little bit of a problem here because in order to be formally cleared, the way our legal system works is you can't be not guilty of something you never did. So it's a bit of a mess. So I was like, guys, I travel a lot. All we need is the next guy at the next airport not to get the next memo. And here we go all over again. How do we avoid this? So my FBI agent said, here's some phone numbers. Give us a call. We'll take care of it. So ever since then, before I would go anywhere, I would call my FBI agent, not because I had to, but because I chose to. This was a preemptive action on my part. It's like, hey guys, not raising any red flags, letting you guys know this is where I'm going, this is what I'm doing. And those phone calls turned to emails, and the emails got longer and longer. Then I'd make web pages for my FBI agent, and then I'd start sending him all sorts of photos of everything. And then I got to thinking, well, why is this one FBI agent so special? Because I'd send him like thousands and thousands of words. I'd write to him, and he'd always say, "Thank you, be safe," and that's it. So it was a little bit of an unbalanced relationship. So I decided that I was going to communicate openly with my FBI agent and everyone else. And this is way back. We're talking like, way, way, way in the early days of smartphones when they were not really that smart. You remember those old Nokia 6600s that, you had the T9 keyboard and you had to like hit a whole bunch of buttons just to type out like a 5-letter word. And this is why we still see this weird like text on chat. It's like, it's like, no, you have a full keyboard. You can type out the whole word now. And you'll actually have autofill that'll do the whole thing for you, autocomplete. So way back in the days of dumb smartphones, I essentially wrote up some code that turned it into a tracking device. And I would take a photo, it would upload the photo, it would show the map of where I was, what I was doing, it would show you how to map. Now, none of the photos pointed towards me. It's not the selfie in the tradition, but it was the camera was always pointed outward. So, when we probably take hundreds and thousands of selfies, it's not necessarily the image that's relatively important. It's the metadata that's behind it. It's all the metadata. And this is what the NSA basically does with metadata scraping. But if you flip the camera around, it's the outside. What are we seeing on the outside? So since 9/11, or give or take, and some of the images predate 9/11, I've taken thousands and thousands and thousands of these photos that I've shared with the FBI. So all of these images have been shared. And in the work here and at Fort Worth, this is a small sampling. So, it's kind of like, how do you show it? How do you show a digital archive of like 150,000 images? How do you show all your emails? If we were to print out all our emails, how massive would that be? How do you show these digital databases in a very physical analog space? And I find it really, really beautiful that I'm in this show with screens about screens, and I make all my work is about screens, and I'm not showing a single screen. And everything is just basically these flat photographs. But there's a lot of specificity that's really important here too. This is a real special show for me, a very special space. When Alison first reached out to me, my immediate was, yes, absolutely. I want to do the show because I really, I was completely blown away by the invitation. The backstory of this is that, so talking about specificity to the space. So this work was created specifically for that wall. And, many, many, many years ago when I was a, punk ass kid flunking out of architecture school, I had discovered a relatively obscure architect at that time by the name of Tadao Ando. And this happens to be one of Ando's first major buildings in America. And so the opportunity to work in this space and actually have the work built into the space, that was amazing. This is like one of these, this is like a life, this is one of those like life moments. And I was just when I'm walking into the space and seeing that work in that building, in that building that of this person that had been so influential in my understanding as an artist, and So this was really important for me there. The other thing that's also interesting, these are the little bit of hidden tidbits. There's photos in that image with Jacoby Satterwhite. There's photos in that image when I was with Trevor Paglen. There's photos in that image when I was with Lynn Leeson Hirschman. So they're scattered around. You would never know them unless I pointed them out to you. But there's a lot of real specific things in that work. So anyway, so that's a little bit about the background. I can go on about some of the other things, but no.
And just to explain for everyone, every one of the artists that Hasan just mentioned is in the exhibition. So it's this sort of funny, it's a meta moment, right? But I think I'm sort of tempted. I want to talk about the metadata, and then of course I don't. But this way of trying. I think one of the things that's interesting for me about the project and the various different versions I've seen of it is, that the image is this image, and the image is what carries this other piece of information that's super important. And it's weird because when we talk about it as metadata, it becomes really abstract and hard to grasp. But actually, photos are already always doing that, right? Photos are always carrying for people all this other information. That's part of what photo, it's not just what the photo is, right? But when a photo is one that and it's personal to you and you were there, whatever, you actually do carry all the stuff outside the photograph with you in terms of what it is. Those of us who then write about it are trying to figure out what all that other stuff is. But then it becomes this interesting thing where it becomes a mosaic, right? So I've seen it as you've done it as curtains, I've seen it, but here it's this mosaic. And I think the tiling is kind of interesting, like this choice. And these blocks of color are always seem to be a part of how you present it. Why? Why the blocks of color?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, well, first, again, to connect it to the Fort Worth Museum, the color field paintings, the abstract expressionism, so there is a direct link to that. Alison and I were just I was saying it semi-snarkily, jokingly, but I'm just a color field painter. That's what I do. But it's actually interesting because when you look at those colors, this is they come from calibration screens. This is the color of the SMPTE colors, and there's various patterns on them. There's various different variations for different types of broadcast, different types of technologies. But the colors historically, do you remember there was a time when we used to have the emergency broadcast system?
I do remember.
No, some of us actually, this predates a lot of it, but some of us do remember that point. Was just because it doesn't exist anymore. Now we just get these things that buzz on our phones. But, there was this time when it was, this is a test of the emergency broadcast system. Had this been a real emergency, you would have been instructed what to do. And that's where those color screens come from. So first, that's exactly the same screen that broadcasters would use for calibrating the information. So in this moment when we're producing so much information, the calibration of it becomes that much more important. And secondly, this is also about impending doom, because when you saw that screen, it either meant that the broadcast had ended for the year, or for the day, or that it meant that, oops, there's a test, and then the Soviets might attack at any moment. So this type of the use of the emergency broadcast systems, that's where those color blocks come from very specifically. In this case, if you'll notice, it's actually upside down. And that's another way of making a very subtle reference to the history of photography and the camera obscura. Right. The fact that if you had this tiny dot at one end of the wall, it would project upside down in this one. So there's those things. And then the colors, they're very deliberately taken from those calibration systems. So this is a very specific type of broadcast that uses this type of test pattern, and then the images are essentially sectioned. The other part, this is a slightly different because of the color, the way the colors span in this. But generally, the yellow ones are usually Tuesdays, the cyan ones are Wednesday, the green ones are Thursday. So there actually is a method to this. Even though there's all this data, it's actually plucked in. So the original version that this was, and I think, Alessandro, you may have seen it in Buffalo, where, so Tina Ryan, who wrote one of the essays in this exhibition catalog, was a curator of a show at the
Difference machines at the AKG.
Yes, exactly. That I was just about to, yeah.
For audience who are curious about that show, I reviewed it in the Brooklyn Rail, so you can read about it.
Yeah, and in that one, that's very specifically 7 stripes, and that was every other image that was sent to the FBI. So there's at first it seems like a random mishmash of just images just coming out, but there's actually a method to the madness, and the sequencing is actually quite important in it, at least for me, even though it may not be readable to the audience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as with so much work, I think there's a lot that the artists do that isn't always entirely readable, right? Hence why we have these long text that people like me or Allison like to write, so we can be like, listen, there's all this other stuff you want to know, right? Before I get to Alice's work, I just want to touch on one other piece. It's the Penelope Umbrico sunsets. I just want to draw a couple sort of things around images and how images are being moved across some of the different artists in the show. So we saw with Kahlil's work, right, the sort of wallpaper of these different, pictures that he has and images and the different sort of relationships he's creating among them in this very sort of intentional way, in the way in which we have these sort of digital archives. Then with Hasan's work, it's this very explicit, archive of your life and movements that is then being organized for each different version according to the various specifications, as you said. And then Penelope's work is at the when you go to the second floor of the museum, it's at the top of the stairs. And this is a work that I've only ever seen online. I'd never seen it exhibited. And so it was sort of striking to me because I associate it so much with not only its digital content, but the digital experience I've had of it. And so for the audience, Penelope Umbrico, initially with Flickr was the website Flickr was basically going through and pulling images that people take of the sun, of sunsets, and how one of the things we all do, and at least I do it, and maybe if you don't, you're not like this, but like we have these things. It's like, the view as you're driving along a highway, it's like a stop, viewpoint, and you stop and you get off, and you and every other person are standing there taking the same shot of the same cliffs and the same trees and whatever, right? There's a beautiful sunset, it's a beautiful day at the ocean or whatever, and you take these images. But what she shows across this work that is basically appropriation, right? It's an appropriation work where she's taking all these images that other people have done, is the way in which we're all taking pictures of the same thing. And yet we're all taking them with this sort of personal thing of like, I have seen this beautiful thing. I have participated in this beautiful moment. And, as someone who thinks a lot about visual culture, it's a interesting example of the way in which, because we are so inflected with images, the thousands and thousands of images we see every single day, not even to speak of the advertising, right? But just in terms of images, how we start to see things guided by the images we've seen already, so that we start to get a sense of like, this is how it should look, this is what it should be. And the challenge of breaking out of that, right? The challenge of being able to see differently and therefore potentially think differently. And this is a sort of an interesting, like this bright, collection of these suns is, as you're walking into a show called I'll Be Your Mirror, this very interesting sort of mirror reflection of the normativity of image culture, broadly speaking, and the challenge of trying to break out of that, in no small part because often people don't want a different image, right? Like I've had the experience of family members being like, why'd you send that weird image? We just wanted like a nice picture of you, right? That kind of thing. So this is just to speak a little bit about the way in which these photographs are, with these different artists, and there's others in the show, are moving across some of the sort of complexities around photography in terms of like the last 50 years of photography shifting out of just simply being documentation. Also, having had this sort of artsy moment with surrealism, returning in because of installation art into this sort of documentation moment, but then that moving into this kind of staging of situations that photography started to be able to do. Jeff Wall, Gregory Cruz, and some of those people. But then the way in which with the digital camera, we all started to participate in these practices without necessarily having had the critical feedback of understanding what we were choosing to do and what sorts of ideas we were reproducing. And the kind of uncomfortable loop that can feel like. And so I wanted to sort of position that as a way of like moving oddly into Alice. And I realize this may seem strange, but I hope you'll follow me with the challenge of what it means to make speculative work, right? And I was hoping that you would speak obviously about this particular work, but also a little bit about how you move through like a set of images of what things will be like, all the sort of future imaginaries of our culture, to create something that might be something else.
Yeah, I like that opener a lot. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like having looked at two works and other works in the show that are super archival or focusing on this like collaging of material or imagery or histories in this like multi-layered way. I guess like maybe my work is archival in the sense it's like research based, but then the final product, the singular environment or the singular world, is sort of I guess takes a slightly different approach, let's say. But that being said, like I think one of the real powerful elements of speculative fiction, and I guess I would maybe get a little nerdy and split that away from science fiction, in the sense that science fiction is typically set in a moment in the far future, where technologies that don't exist currently are very much underway. Like it's like science fiction explores ideas of like going to other galaxies or time travel or sort of more sophisticated, like more hard, there's like more of a focus on like hard technologies, right? Whereas like speculative fiction or like soft science fiction is much more focused on, I guess like taking like a sociological or anthropological approach, but also thinking about narratives that are happening in the very near future or narratives that are actually already ongoing. And then for me, like the key difference in the sort of world making process that I have and my interest in speculative fiction is the media's or the approach, like the ideology of spec fic sort of moves beyond or rejects the binary thinking of utopia or dystopia that appears a lot in science fiction. Like whether it's good or bad, most science fiction focuses on a world that's either completely utopian or completely dystopian. And I just find that binary like not very helpful in thinking about.
And just say, I feel like we are seeing so much of that binary in relationship to conversations around AI. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like, I think it's something that seems to just get attached in this weird way to every time a new conversation emerges about a technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, like the Earthseed 2150 project, it's like sometimes I work in a very sort of intensive way where like the works and the worlds that I build are these like, feature length films. And other times I approach game engines and speculative fiction as a sort of like prototype or like primer maybe for like a larger body of research, like for instance, like the future of water and water systems and the water crisis that we're facing right now, which I think will be like the biggest crisis of the 21st century, I would say. And yeah, like this work, it's really short compared to my other works. Like it's less than 8 minutes long. So it's almost like a primer or an idea for an ongoing concern of mine. And the work itself, like a lot of the time in my worlds, I tend to latch onto or speak the contents of the world through non-human characters. And this piece in particular focuses on the Arctic tern, which, yeah, when I was actually making this piece, this was in like the heyday of like COVID summer 2021. And it was, I think, in like June, and all the swifts had just flown into London. And swifts are these incredible birds, and they actually share a lot in common with Arctic terns. Both birds travel like 2 or 3 times the circumference of the Earth in 1 year, like 50,000, 60,000 miles. And they spend like 80% or more of their life in air. They feed in the air, they mate in the air, they sleep in the air, they turn off like one half of their brain and keep one eye open just to avoid fall. But they'll fly up super, super high so that they can just like drift down in their sleep. And I was also thinking, like, in the context of the show, like, I'll Be Your Mirror. I mean, it's really exciting for me to be in a show that has such a kind of history, like working across different decades, like across different technological innovations. But the one thing that really struck me about the show, like, is its starting point, 1969, the works that are included, because that's actually like the year that one of the first images of the whole Earth was taken from outer space. And also, of course, like the Apollo broadcast. So I think at the time that the show begins, it's kind of already the age of the planetary. And in the work, like the Arctic tern is seeing or is seen to be flying over this kind of aquatic landscape. It's set in 2150, which is 60 years after Octavia Butler's Parables series sees humanity abandon the Earth. Basically, yeah, it's seen as a lost cause, and in order to survive, humans need to exit their mother planet. But I was really interested in kind of, because I mean, yeah, a lot of like spacefaring, sci-fi, even conversations around just like exploring other planets or moving to other planets, like there's very little consideration for what would actually happen to Earth like after humans leave. So the video itself is kind of looking at this like dehumanized Earth, I guess, that has been left for as a kind of wreckage or a point of no return. But then kind of learning to see maybe that wreckage as something actually capable of like a new kind of life that doesn't center the human. And that's sort of what I mean about like the utopia, like blurring the utopia dystopia binary in my work. Like it always kind of has these components of like there's like usually some kind of element of like hyper capitalism. So in this piece too, like it's kind of part of an ongoing interest of mine in the privatization of water, plans to open up desalination plants in the US, which, yeah, I mean, like I'm looking currently at the Californian case point of that, but I was also interested to read that Texas is planning to build its own desalination plant in the port of Corpus Christi. Currently it's like being blocked legally, but yeah, this is sort of a very near future concern where these gigantic plants with huge carbon emissions will be gulping up salt water and sending them through very energy intensive processes in order to make it drinking water. So yeah, I mean, I could talk more about the work, but maybe that's a good intro.
You remind me of some brief research I was doing with someone about a year ago around the history of rivers and basically water capitalism. And so the way in which rivers in Europe and dams and so forth had actually been very, very important to the rise of capitalism in the early modern period. But anyway, I think, just to sort of bring it back around all of the works in the show, I think one of the things that's really provocative, Alison, about the way in which you sort of, brought these different works together is that you covered so much content. And so, I mean, I don't think there's a medium that isn't included in this show. Like it was all of them, right? It was like, it's a pretty good, like, just, hey, what is contemporary art? Like here's lots of different things that artists are doing too, right? But I was intrigued by the fact that, and there's something about time that sort of happened for me. And I was just wondering, the way in which the sort of past, present, future, these ideas, and the three of you sort of provide some interesting reflection points on this in the sense of, how art can mirror for us what we might be going towards, our present, and also where we're coming from. And the way in which, like, you're producing works that may have a research component, right? That are part of your daily lives, but that are also about moving something forward. And I guess I was just wondering, because of the kind of obsession people have with their devices and the sort of way in which it can feel like you are out of time in relationship to the device, because you're not paying attention to where you are or the people around you or whatever. Nevertheless, the way in which all three of you, I've just felt to me as if time was a component of the work you're doing. And I just wanted to ask if that's totally off, right? Just like me making stuff up, or if time and ideas around time is something that's present for you.
I think I can jump in on this one because, this is a project that I've been working on, more than half my adult life. It's a long time. And what this project was when it first was initiated is very different than what this project is today. So having this real privilege to be able to see this work span across a multiple decades, it means something very different to me now than it did when it first started. Honestly, I'm not even sure when it first started. Did it start with the very first photo? Did it start with the very first call to the FBI agent? Did it start with the very first art exhibition, if you want to call it? It's hard to. So back then, it served as a very different purpose. The other thing that's also really interesting about this whole thing is when I started this project, people thought I was crazy. People were like, "Why are you taking a picture of your food? What are you doing this for? Don't show up at my house if you're going to do this." And now, now I'll talk about it at a college or something, and students will look at me like, "What's the big deal? I don't get it. This looks like my Instagram feed." So the normalization of this, I think, is at least in this content for me, the self-surveillance of it, the aspect of time has certainly made it so much more normalized. And I think to see what it meant at one time versus what it meant now, another aspect of this is when I started this project, our intelligence agencies were still in a relatively analog system. There was a thought that we could potentially throw so much information that the analog system just would not be able to keep up, and that's true in an analog structure. But now with data and big data and AI, the more information you feed it, the more proficient it becomes. So again, it's changed drastically on what that means or what the action means. So that's my take on the span of time on this, and actually and being able to look at this and being able to work on this project for 20 plus years.
I mean, I would say that, like, in speculative fiction, the idea of linear time is kind of exploded. Like, I don't know, it's kind of this much more of an interest in like circular time, or the idea that like the past is always, or like the future is always feeding into the past, and the past is like reshaping the future. like that there's the ways that we sort of divvy up and structure our lives in this very sort of like Enlightenment era progress. And I mean, capitalism is the same way, right? This like idea that things are always going to get better and better and better. And we're definitely at like a crisis point in our existence where we're realizing that like many of the consequences of like climate actions that we've already taken or not taken are now sort of rearing their head, and it's almost too late. So there's this kind of collision or like implosion, let's say, not just of this like linear progressive capitalist order, but also in the ways that like past, present, and future interrelate. So I take a lot of influence and inspiration from, yeah, speculative fiction ideas of circle time. And I also think water operates in a similar way too.
Water operates in the circular way because of the cycles it goes through, or?
Cycles, sure, but then also what you were talking about with like the invention of capitalism and the kind of insanely hubristic attempt to divvy up a flowing resource into neat parcels of private property. I think water can be a really incredible point of resisting some of those narratives around privatization. So it's kind of ironic that, yeah, we're now at a point where like water scarcity is kind of entering into this like corporate water production process as well, like drinking water.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to say something quickly too about time that Hasan's comment kind of reminded me of, but there's a lot of works in the show, of course, historical works like Gretchen Bender's Total Recall from 1987, and even Namjoon Paik's TV Buddha, which of course is a motif he started in 1974, although the TV Buddha in the show here is from 92. You know, those were, Bender's, for example, was highly critical of mass media in 1987 and was this kind of exaggerated barrage of information being blasted into our faces daily by television. It's a bank of 24 television sets and 3 projections, and really was kind of this almost a caricature of what the information stream of television could become. And it's been really interesting taking people through that show. I always look at that work as being incredibly prescient, but a lot of younger viewers don't understand that it's a barrage. And I think they're just fully kind of used to that barrage due to the way things have changed for us. So I think it's really interesting to kind of see that, how time has maybe, same with what Hasan was saying about his, we're all surveilling ourselves now. It's much more normalized. So it's really, I think, interesting to have these, earlier works and themes that maybe were, completely radical for different reasons at the time, just feel a little bit more normalized now. The Paik TV Buddha, of course, it's a sculpture of a 18th century Buddha looking into a television that's projecting an image of its face. It's this kind of closed loop image. And it's been so interesting because I really connected with it for this show, thinking about, kind of the vanity of contemporary social media and how it's this reflection, this mirror of one's own image. And just to see visitors interact with it now, they are often taking selfies with it. And situating themselves in which they're being reflected in the television screen too. So it's interesting to see how these themes have really kind of become normalized throughout culture today.
Yeah, I'm realizing that I am now responsible for allowing all the other audience members to ask questions. And Carolyn, I want to let you take that over, though I also still have many questions to ask. So I would jump back in if I get the opportunity. But otherwise, I just want to say very, very briefly, we didn't even get to all the different images and works in the show that I had thought that we might get a chance to speak to. I realized that Fort Worth may not be next door to where you are, but if I can encourage you to see the show. I think it's a really extraordinary exhibition that doesn't just speak to technology, but actually speaks to who we are and what we're living through and what we're trying to think through. There's just so much more to say, but thank you for participating with me for a little bit, you all.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. Thank you all so much. Let's see, we have an interesting comment I'm just going to echo from the chat. If anybody wants to take this up, feel free, from Deborah Rooney, who says, what an interesting perspective on screens and connectedness and reflection in my field, medicine. Some fear that dependence on screens/tech and the clinical images/data they relay actually disconnects care providers from their patients, a dichotomy, which maybe goes back to the kind of constant binary we're always seeing that you mentioned. But I don't know if anybody wants to kind of expand on that or any thoughts there.
I will. You should jump in that way. You should just jump in if you want to. But I just want to say, I mean, I think it is a dichotomy. I think one of the things that we didn't kind of get to is that the show does a really interesting job of moving, as you're going through the exhibition, of moving in and out of different affective experiences around technology. It is a problem. It also is a part of our lives that does interesting things, and I'm always slightly uncomfortable with dichotomies because I feel like I might get stuck. But I think one of the challenges is technology isn't the only thing, right? There's also this human element that we're actually hybrid. This experience is a hybrid one. And I think part of what we're challenged with is really addressing a hybrid life, recognizing what technology can do and where it serves and where there's something else that's being asked of us and is necessary. And when we can start to recognize that these two things are these two things that are working alongside each other, we might be able to ask of each other things that we're currently asking of technology, and ask of technology things that we're currently asking of each other, and find some kind of more interesting or more sustainable as a life experience relationship between those two. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, fascinating. Great, thank you. Thank you, Deborah, also for putting that in there. Let's see, I'm going to go to Eleanor next for a question. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And thank you for this amazing conversation. It's been so mind-blowing. Alice, I was really interested in you bringing up Octavia Butler. And I'm curious for everybody to answer if there are other texts or artists who are kind of grounding inspirations to your work.
I can go first. I'll keep it quick. I mean, yeah, I feel like you can't really talk about Octavia Butler without talking about Ursula K. Le Guin, on the other hand. A text that I reread a lot is a short story of hers called The Word for World is Forest. And I think that text is so beautiful in terms of thinking about language also as a technology, and a world-making technology, and also a world-destroying one, because the term like worlding or world building floats around a lot these days. But interestingly, it has the word worlding as a verb has its roots in post-colonial theory. Gayatri Spivak published a text about it, which basically understands the ways in which language was used as a colonial tool. I mean, she talks about also like map making. So this idea of like the construction of a space in order to almost like will that space into submission or into reality, and language in a similar way. Like when, colonizers bring with them their language, when another language gets stamped out, a world is lost or destroyed. So I think it's a really incredible text. It's also loosely based on the Vietnam War and was published like concurrently within that. But it also talks about like language strategies as a potential for resistance. So like in order to create new worlds or challenge the present world, like language can be a really powerful tool in that sense. And then I also really love Elvia Wilkes' work. She's more in the kind of nonfiction territory, although she has written a fiction book called Oval, which looks at like kind of like art, technology, and like gentrification in Berlin. But yeah, Elvia's recent text, Death by Landscape, is like a collection of essays that does some really important groundwork, I think, in reconceptualizing our relationship to the environment and also like speculating on future ecologies. It's a really wonderful work, so I definitely recommend checking it out.
I think one of the ones that's been really that sticks with my mind is Guillermo Verdeguia, who wrote a short story. It was Citizen Suarez is the book, and there's one very short. It's like literally like 500-600 words, and it's called The Uncle's Disappearance, and it's about him. His uncle, who used to work at the Argentine Armed Forces as a person that actually just went through surveillance photos, and he would have to identify bits and pieces of things in there, and you know, because these are splotches. What do splotches mean when they're or what are these types of like balloons of a kid? What does that mean to be interpreted? So it's really fascinating. It's super short and it's super dense, and I always go back to this one text. In terms of what is shown in an image and what is interpreted from the image, particularly in this, and it's just really brilliantly written too. So I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. That was awesome. I wrote all those down. Thank you so much.
Yeah, everyone check out the chat for the links there. Yeah, thanks, Eleanor, so much. Let's see, I just have maybe one more question here, mostly for Alison. I think Kahlil had to hop off, but I was surprised to hear him say that he was surprised to be asked to be in the show, given, you know, the kind of framing of the work. And I guess I'm wondering about sort of the borders of your curation for this show. In that framing, like what would just not be included? Like I'm not sure if I saw a woven piece in there, but I was starting to think about, of course, the technology of weaving, and so you know, that's maybe a big question for just a couple minutes left, but yeah, I'm curious about your decisions there.
No, that's a good one. That's funny that you mentioned weaving too, because I actually I did a show a few years ago with Analia Saban, who does weavings based on semiconductors, and they're all just inextricably linked to technology. And I thought about her for the show, but I was, you know, really thinking about how we had just focused on her work separately. So, I mean, there really weren't any borders, though, I will say. What was really important to me is there's really only been a handful of large-scale exhibitions in recent years that have dealt with themes of art and technology. So in thinking of that, you know, typically these shows kind of look at the same players, I would say. And, you know, maybe it was partially the pandemic, I don't know, but I started with this giant database, and I really tried to look at every single exhibition that made sense, every artist. I was looking at MFA programs and just compiled this giant database of over 400 artists, and just really started kind of calling my list from that and letting the themes emerge on their own. And so it kind of happened organically. And I think it really lent a lot of flexibility to the way in which I was working. Of course, I had to think about the physical space here too. So yeah, there was various angles that I was taking towards this in ways that I've never really organized a show like that before. But again, I really wanted it to be open-ended, and I wanted to include as many artists as possible. This is the biggest group show that the Modern's ever had, with 50 artists. But of course, it was really hard to cull it down from my initial list.
Yeah, I can't imagine doing that job. Thank you. Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you all for your questions. So here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Courtney Bush. Poet and filmmaker Courtney Bush is from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. She lives and works as a nanny in New York. She's the author of Isn't This Nice? Every book is about the same thing, and I Love Information, a 2022 National Poetry Series selection forthcoming this year from Milkweed Editions. Her films have been screened at festivals internationally. Thank you so much, Courtney, for being here. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so interesting. I feel like I just learned a ton. So I'm really excited to read. I'm going to read this poem called The Lamb with the Talking Scroll. It's just to briefly contextualize. It's like a very common symbol in some Renaissance paintings. And I actually didn't realize that, of course, it's biblical. It's the lamb with the scroll in Revelation. But I just think the concept of that form of communication is interesting. A lamb with a scroll in its mouth, it unrolls, the scroll talks. I got a little bit obsessed with that. So, okay, the lamb with the talking scroll. The day I quit my job, I walked into a dark room lined with mirrors, and Rilke said the angel was a mirror facing another mirror. So it was pure containment, and I knew whatever left my mouth dissolved as it formed. Was it wrong to wonder what I was dissolving into, if the angel absorbed part of me for once? And the lights went down even further. On the dance floor, a friend told me after the second week of continuous drawing, he got better at it. And suddenly he could look at his friends and see them in the blue and yellow shades of his pencils. He said, I don't know when, but I know which drawing. It was Sunny, her legs bent like an egret's. And I looked at my drawing and I looked at her, and they were the same thing. And I said I knew which drawing he meant. I had seen it, and pulled the pink ribbon at his throat. He told me he had watched me smoke and said, I'll tell you this because you care about words. I don't know how I feel. When I told you earlier, that was a lie. I was turning to the piano not to discover the melody, but to confirm it. The light is pulsing. I can't tell what's counting, but it's not the thought. I put this here so I don't have to say it. And a thought should never be broken up into parts of thoughts. Novels don't have colors. Movies don't have sentences you can see. Songs don't have anything. A drawing of my sister was taped to the wall, and none are anything like life. And I cried on the train before I even saw Augie's busted face. And I cried when the man sang High Hopes. And I cried when the baseball player called his mom, and cried in the Druid circle on the heath. While my boyfriend played country songs, I walked around the bar, holding out the tip jar, and thought of my little daughter, Wreath, my daughter, Death, my daughter's goodness and mourning. To my daughters, leaving makes more sense than staying. I wanted all those dancing people to come with me. That is what my love was doing, beckoning, wanting ever more. And I saw two there, exhaling on the corner into the empty street. The one in the red feather boa collapsing, the other pulling at the taped up cuff. And in my ecstasy, I wanted them, but let them go. Outside a closed restaurant, a TV screen glitched and trembled with braised lamb noodles, shining burgundy meat and mustard gold, green sprigs of herb a dove might carry in its beak to communicate something to the faraway king. In another room, I heard a woman singing into screams through smeared lipstick, a gash of a mouth, and it smells like something there. And you prick your finger, you write your name in the book. A frail boy fell to the ground and security stormed the perimeter. The drugs were hidden. The ones screaming help were asked, what do you need? You said help, but what do you need? And help was the only response. I wanted to invent a new way of existing. Adelina eats vodka and Ozempic now. Buck eats my hair. My one friend keeps getting Botox and calling it acupuncture. I spun around and found him removing his sweater on the basement table. I raised my arms to spin again and wondered if any adult had ever tried to convey to me that this life is worth living. A woman's voice rolled over her words, tumbled their meaning smooth. The man in front of a blue map laughed. When I'm in love, I become detail-oriented. How much I hated myself, refracted through several martinis, I became nasty, savoring the drops of cruelty and the desire to know things, and masochism and stupidity. I thought of the future, the car wreck TV shows, the one about customers who scream at cashiers, and guns. I raised my arms and thought about safety in numbers, in 3 and 4 and 7. The lamb spoke, not in numbers, but by carrying her little scroll, opening her mouth to drop her message on the ground, the one message she was tasked with carrying, the one she wouldn't lose. And it said something wonderful. It had the answer no angel would ever give, the answer the angels had embodied when they laughed and lifted higher. You read the scroll and felt amazing. You rolled it up, you placed it softly in her jaws and rubbed the pink skin. It would never be said that I was the man who started to build and could not finish. It would never be true. We lose most of what is said and thought and wanted. What she said when I unrolled the scroll, what she said was link rot, little more, little town full of little people. What she said was sleep is work. Say it with me, sleep is work. She told my little capitalist heart, and all I know is I was astonished. Thank you. That's the poem.
Wow, thank you so much, Courtney, for closing us out today. Incredible. Yeah, thank you, of course, Kahlil and Hasan, Alice, Allison, and Charlotte. Thank you to everyone at the Modern for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. Today's conversation will be up there shortly. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate. And do join us Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Arya Dean and Mackenzie Wark. And we'll conclude with a poetry reading by Kay Alado McDowell. And you can all now turn on your microphones and say hi and bye as you leave. Thank you so much again.
Thank
Bye,
you so
everybody.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.